Cool. We affirm the resolve that multilateral relations ought to be preferred over bilateral relations by developing economies. Developing economies are economies that lack significant GDP. Ought is used to indicate duty and correctness. Multilateral is involving more than two parties. Bilateral is coordination with a single other country. And preferred is tending to choose, while relations are trade, diplomacy, and other agreements by countries. This debate's primarily from the perspective of developing nations. It's also not excluding bilateral nations. We're considering the benefits of both, but considering how it affects developing nations to prioritize multilateral relations over bilateral relations. So we'll be weighing on net benefits of either type of relation. Contention one is going to be about the economy. So the first big one is going to be with the idea of most favored nations and organizations like the WTO, the EU, the UN. These multilateral organizations that prioritize economic efficiency and trade relations between multiple countries seem to do this through only multilateral agreements. When we have multiple countries to prioritize, we're able to implement ideas such as most favored nations, which benefit developing countries with lower prices and helps their economies, increasing quality of life. Most favored nations has been implemented in the CAFTA-Doctor Act, which was signed on 2004 and reduced U.S. tariffs on Latin America by 80%, which increased trade by 900% for this underdeveloped country. This led to the access of resources such as medicine, healthcare, and a lot of other key goods for the region that Latin America simply wasn't receiving until we proposed lower prices for these regions. And most favored nations just prioritizes underdeveloped nations to treat all trade partners equally. And when we have multilateral agreements and we have a globalist perspective on international relations and economic relations and military relations, we have a lot more fairness in the distribution of the wealth through these countries, right? We have the ability to provide the people that need things at lower prices, such as developing countries like Latin America, the resources that they need at the price that they can afford. And this means we can impose higher prices where it's necessary on countries like the UK or the United States, where they can make up for that dividend. And we're able to fill in the gaps of a global economy. A globalized economy is benefited extremely by a multilateral trade agreement. And this globalized economy is incredibly important for developing nations to integrate within if they want to succeed in increasing their quality of life, their GDP, and expanding their economy as a whole. Again, we saw this was essential with like the World Trade Organization and in Latin America because they treat all countries, regardless of their size, equally in these contexts. So first on economy, you have to vote for us, but then we'll go to cooperation because diplomacy.edu says funds for global cooperation, for multilateral global cooperation, dwindle in the face of rising nationalism. Multilateralism helps provide cultural exchange and meaningful cooperation, preventing from the ideological dominance of autocratic regimes. This gives countries bigger presences on the world stage and makes all voices heard, which reduces war in the long run. The use of bilateral agreements is extremely pervasively effective to developing nations because they are susceptible to make partners with anybody at the cost of necessity. This leads to the development of autocratic or authoritarian regimes within these countries. This can be seen in China's relations with Zimbabwe or through the BRI initiative throughout most of West Africa. A lot of issues with them using their economic provisions to these countries and their military provisions to these countries to propel and propagate communist propaganda throughout the region. The same thing happens when they've made bilateral agreements in the Middle East and also with Russia in places like Kazakhstan, Bergia, and all these places where they use their energy deals to expand the communist ideals. So to solve climate change, we need multilateral approaches because it's a global effect. 3.4 million people are already dying annually from climate change. And when we cooperate on these issues, when we have more cooperative efforts in these areas that are disproportionately harmed by the impacts of climate change, underdeveloped nations, then we're able to allow for more cooperation. Cooperation is key in all these global issues, such as economic development, integration, protection of human rights. And these multilateral agreements almost always prioritize human rights. The UN, the EU, the WTO, and the WHO all have provisions within their stipulations that require the prioritization of fair, humane, and ethical practices within all signatories of the agreements. Thus, developing nations need to join multilateral agreements to prevent the abuse of human rights and the violation of human rights through the expansion of autocratic regimes and through the increase of cooperation, making us give an actual fighting chance against climate change because these nations are disproportionately affected by it. Now, we need to understand that multilateralism is needed for communication and institutions to prevent war and climate catastrophe. If we don't have multilateralism, we don't have intervention methods, we don't have checks and balances, and we need to actually consider the weight of fairness in today's debate. When we have multilateral agreements in developing countries, we give all of these countries a bigger presence on the world stage with multiple countries looking over them. When we have developing economies and developed economies working side by side, we're able to reduce the impact of climate change on these countries. Turn to India for the climate change example. India is an incredible developing nation that happens to produce an incredible proportion of greenhouse gas emissions. Their economy relies primarily on coal based interventions because they have no resources within their region to actually access clean energy. Multilateral agreements through the WTO and through the UN have recently provided provisions to allow India to convert to a cleaner energy network. These provisions are being made in multiple countries across the world and helping with developing nations all over the place. This is key to fighting climate change. Developing nations need the support of multiple developed nations to help them win in any form of crisis when we're looking at the crisis of autocratic expansion and when we're looking at the idea of climate crises. This matters in outer space too. We need the proper framework and multilateralism when we go out into outer space, and the risks of not having multilateral cooperations when countries like India are signing the Artemis Accord to go out into outer space in the next 10 years pose significant risks because these countries will be wasting millions of their infrastructure, threatening quality of life throughout their country, and not being able to effectively take on these missions without the ability to be supported by multiple countries that all ensure the provision of human rights, ethical economic practices, and fair standards are being upheld through all these regions. Thus, multilateral agreements are preferable to developing nations when bilateral relations can be used to manipulate these nations, exert economic power over the nation, and form an ineffective and unsustainable approach to creating any form of action against these crises. When we're talking about fairness, there are places like the CFA franc, which were used in Africa, instituted by France, and the Belt and Road Initiative to implement control over these regions in bilateral agreements. Right, France implemented the CFA franc in regions of Africa, which is its own currency, which made them profit more, but it didn't necessarily help Africa at all. Developing nations shouldn't have to pick sides in unbalanced agreements, and they also shouldn't be forced to solely align with one side in a multipolar world. This risk is that they will solely side with China or Russia or other countries like that. So we need to actually understand the impacts of today's debate, that multilateralism is essential to progress in developing countries, and thus you must vote affirmative.
All right, we're all feeling good. All ready for me to speak. Just a reminder, I'm Isaac Hutz. I use they, them pronouns. I will begin my speech now. Okay, firstly, let's get into some framing. Firstly, I think that we just have to argue that like our burden of proof is just to argue that a preference shouldn't be placed on one or the other, like abstract of like kind of the specificities of what the agreement is. Right? You know, the government burden is to prove that in order for multilateralism to be preferred to bilateralism, a country must reject a deal that is maybe a little bit more favorable to them with one country, with one country in favor of a deal that's comparatively less favorable to them, but in multiple countries. I'm sorry, I'm pausing time because I'm hearing some kind of sound, but it's like very quiet, so I'm not like sure what's going on.
Yeah, no worries. Just FYI, I just stopped the time because I'm having a really hard time hearing you. I don't know if that's just me. I just thought it's worth noting.
Okay, is that a problem with other people, or is that a?
Yeah, I was having a bit of difficulty as well.
Okay, well, does this sound clear to you? Is this working?
Yeah, I think that's somewhat better.
Like somewhat better. Okay. Well, you understood what I said enough to respond to it cogently, so I'm hoping that's about as good as it's gonna get. Sorry for the inconvenience. I'm going to resume my time now. The government burden is to prove that, in order for multilateralism to be preferred to bilateralism, a country must reject a deal more favorable to them with one country or a deal that might be comparatively less favorable to them but with multiple countries. Right? Reasonably, we're not saying that government has to defend entering into really bad deals in the same way that, like, we're not saying that we should reject all multilateral things, institutions that, like, exist in the world, or we're not saying reject the UN or anything. I think like the example here is that if you have to choose between one agreement, like one single agreement between 5 countries, and 4 separate, and like you're a developing nation versus 4 separate agreements with each of the countries, would prefer 4 different agreements with the same countries rather than one big agreement. I think that's like the kind of point at which a preference comes into play. Okay, so I'm going to get into our 3 contentions. I'm going to get into our opponent's contentions. Firstly, our first contention is about a stronger relationship, and our first sub-contention is about less drama. These agreements are ultimately the results of coinciding of interests, right? The coinciding of five nations' interests, for example, towards each other and towards like the end at hand that the agreement is about, is comparatively much less likely to like stay than the
POC,
coinciding of
drop
two
the time.
nations' interests towards each other and towards. Am I cutting out?
No. So, I just want to ask, of course, a point of clarification.
Okay,
Um,
pausing
just
time.
to confirm, you're saying that the neg burden is to prove that bilateralism should be generally preferred over multilateralism, or
The neg burden is hypothetically no preference, or the off burden. But that what we're going to explain why bilateralism is superior.
okay, excellent, thanks.
Great. I'm going to resume my time. I'm at like 1:45 now. Agreements are the coinciding of five nations' interests towards each other and towards whatever the end at hand is, whether it be like doing this certain kind of trade or having like less border restrictions between each other or whatever, comparatively much less likely than the coinciding of two nations' interests. This means it is significantly more difficult to keep multilateral agreements going because the coinciding of interest is less likely to occur. It seems very easy for two countries or even just one country to pull out and then the whole thing collapses. Comparatively, you have like multiple bilateral agreements. Even if one nation kind of pulls out, is no longer has those interests. The remnants still exist. These other bilateral agreements still exist. Bilateral agreements stay stronger for longer. Our second sub contention is that an agreement between two individuals is stronger because there's a closer relationship, right? Diplomats are more intimately engaged with diplomatic talks with the country on a regular basis, get to know them and grow trust with them. But large multilateral details, like the aforementioned World Trade Organization, are less personal, more bureaucratic, formal. Right? Countries aren't drawn by like genuine allyship or kind of the people's liking each other, or kind of by a sense of cold calculation. Um, right? Compare right? Like look at, for example, like the alliance between the Portuguese and the United Kingdom just stood strong for around 700 years, right? When you get into a bilateral agreement with someone, you form, you're not just saying, oh, the nations are just saying we're similar, that we have these specific interests. You're kind of saying like we're similar nations. We want to be friends. People personify their nations, even if that's not really the case. And this, domestic political attitudes are shaped by relations with the country. Politicians want to appear as if they're rejecting long-standing agreements, commitments. In the United States, we kind of see like the United Kingdom as like, oh, it's like our little brother over the ocean. I think that's cute. I think that like helps keep our relations strong. Our second contention is about more control over ourselves, and that there's more of a voice, right? In a multilateral platform, one nation, particularly a developing nation, has little to bargain with, right? You're only a very small piece of what's going on. We think that in a bilateral platform, you essentially have the ability, you have all the cards on the table. You can gamble with yourself, right? Even if you are like negotiating with a larger nation, there are still mutual benefits involved, which you have total control to like reject and end, right? And on the other hand, if you're like becoming beholden, right? So this means like if you're negotiating with China like through Belt and Road versus one and one, the Belt and Road program is somewhat less successful, matters less to China than like the individual relation you have with them is just ending. I think that makes clear. That gives you more power and control over yourself. Right? If you become beholden to a multilateral pact, we think there is this kind of tyranny of the majority. Like smaller countries in the EU, like for example Greece, barely have any kind of economic agency at all, and are inevitably like deeply affected and harmed when some bigwig, who runs the EU bank, makes some kind of mistake when they screw up the euro or whatever, right? We think that this kind of weakens domestic support within developing nations, and that like like you're manipulated, you're a puppet of the EU or whatever, and also it can just lead to bad outcomes. Second subpoint here is about how it's more specific to your needs. You pick what country you might want to like do trade with, or some other kind of diplomatic agreement with for specific goods, and pick what is most beneficial to you, and you tailor your agreement to specifically your interests, right? Even if your voice wasn't overwhelmed in multilateral agreements, the nature of such an agreement is about consensus, it's about compromise, whereupon concessions are made by the parties to reach an average good, and I think we can do better than the average good. I think we can do specific goods that work for us, and I think we should aim for that. Third point is about how protectionism is actually good. The first subpoint here is about bilateral agreements allow kind of setting of specific tariff levels and mandate particular imports and exports of goods. On the other hand, multilateral agreements involve one principle kind of abided to by all members. Because of this, multilateral agreements tend towards like this very strong kind of total, almost laissez-faire free trade thing and away from protectionism. Why is this? Because it's hard to set uniform tariff rates in larger countries. All the agreements will still want free trade. Like, look at like what happens with like the World Trade Organization, highly encouraging free trade. NAFTA is like this free trade agreement. Why do you not want free trade as a developing economy? Because you want to increase your level of economic infrastructure, you want to develop your economy and support, local businesses. We think this happens through like a comparatively like long-term process of increasing education standards and living standards in your country. You want to shift away from being a resource extraction economy and being into kind of an innovation, resource refining economy. We think if you're locked into a multilateral agreement, which kind of dictates free trade and trade with other countries which already have these very strong kind of advantages in education and even and kind of just better living standards, it's very difficult to be successful. Countries in multilateral agreements are heavily incentivized to drop labor standards. For example, letting huge multinational corporations to make sweatshops and sell those to the I'm sorry, I'm really low on time, so I'm not going to take that. I think right on the other hand, you can do tariffs and individual things. You're not de-incentivizing this way. You can thus pay your workers more. You can thus develop local industry. We think that these are good if you're developing the economy because you would at some point want to become a developed economy. Okay, then our opponents talk about kind of, I think their definitions make sense. I think that we clarified preferred, but I don't think that contradicts. First contention, they say the economy. And they say like there are places like the World Trade Organization and the EU and stuff, and they like maybe do good in the world. And obviously, right, they talk about these like most favored nations program. And of course, like there are great multilateral programs. And there are like obviously just great bilateral programs. Or if we're talking about a preference, we shouldn't be talking about like specific great examples because there are so many groups in the world. I'm sure you can come up with a million great examples on either sides. But instead talk about like the general principle of the matter and the nature of these multilateral and bilateral agreements. So yes, there are some really great, multilateral agreements. Those are some really bad multilateral agreements. So lots of places where countries in kind of multilateral places get screwed over, or the multilateral agreement totally collapses. Look at like BRICS, which barely does anything these days. Then they talk about cooperation. Once again, we think that like there are ways where multilateralism is needed, where it's useful. Though that means that we should like show a specific preference in the same way that like kind of setting specific tariffs and maybe having a protectionist economy is like possible, but more difficult under multilateralism. The same thing goes for the benefits of bilateralism. We think that like ultimately there are these possibilities, but it's a little bit of a wash on this idea of like what is capable under multilateralism versus bilateralism. And for all these reasons, please vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. And I would just like to note, not that it's a big deal, but my opponent did go 15 seconds over the grace period, so just as an FYI. Is everyone...
My timer, I think because of like the POC and like also that time when I wasn't sure what was being, like there was some kind of audio thing about me not being heard.
I posted, but it's not a big deal. Like okay. I don't think it's worth anything. I just thought it was worth noting, of course. So the last 30 seconds not factoring in. So also, can I have the? So if everyone is ready, then judges, just to confirm. Awesome. And opponents, of course, just to confirm. Awesome. Okay, well, with that, starting with an off-time roadmap, I will be going over my opponent's case and quickly look over my own, looking at framework, the contentions, and telling you why exactly the affirmative won today. So starting on my first word. I affirm the resolution that multilateral relations ought to be preferred over bilateral relations by developing economies. So before we go further today, we first need to look at the framework of this round. Most of this is not highly argued, but I think it is good to clarify. So of course, when we're looking at multilateral, it's involving more than two parties, while bilateral is a relationship between one country and another. So there's only two nations involved. And then with preferred, it's having a tendency to choose. So it's not to say that there's an exclusivity, but it is to say that we're preferring these multilateral organizations over these bilateral organizations. And as we proved, and as I'll prove again in today's speech, there is an impetus to do this. And while my opponent does try to advocate that you can prefer it equally, we see there's really no way to do this. There's no way to evaluate this on this basis. But more so, we also see the fact that even if you buy this, or even if you believe bilateral is a better alternative, it's simply not, as we're going to see. So going into today's round, I first want to look, sorry if I miss any signposting, first looking at my opponent's point about multilateral agreements being hard to maintain. And we see not only is this false, but it's illogical. Because my opponent brings up this idea that there's multiple competing interests in these multilateral trade agreements. Okay, so yes, that makes sense. But it also is part of cooperation. These nations are coming together that can be universally agreed on, and the institutions can outlive any one member leaving. My opponent says that in a multilateral organization, if a single member leaves, the whole thing can collapse, whereas in a bilateral organization, some vestiges of it can survive. But again, that's simply not true whatsoever, because literally in a bilateral organization, you have two countries. If one leaves, the entire deal collapses. Whereas in a multilateral agreement, you can have major parties that leave, while the institutions are still kept intact for the countries that want it. We can look for the Trans-Pacific Trade Agreement that the United States founded and then left, but is still maintained by several countries in Oceania and Asia. It's generated billions of dollars in trade. It's helped those developing nations. And so my opponent's idea that somehow this is multilateralism is inherently more unstable is simply false. In fact, what I would say is my opponent hasn't provided any examples of negative multilateral trade agreements, nor long-lasting ones. Compare that to NATO, compare that to the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, long-lasting organizations that have facilitated essential services throughout the world, and we see my opponent's point falsified. So just to sum it up, the idea that multilateral agreements are less able to survive a country leaving than bilateral agreements is simply against all logic. And there's not much more I need to spend with here. Now, going on also to this point that there's more power in bilateral agreements for these smaller countries. Again, that's also untrue. And just before I go further, I would like to know what this debate is about. This debate is about what is good for the developing countries. We're not looking at this through an American-centric lens. We're not looking at this through a Eurocentric lens or even a globally centric lens. We're looking at this specifically through what will help developing nations, what they should do. And so what do we see? This idea that bilateral agreements give countries more bargaining power. Okay, so first, we see this isn't true. Because if you have a big nation, which has a lot to offer, but a small nation, which has very little to offer, without that guarantee of other nations, then you don't have that equal trade. Just like we see with unionization, just like we see with collective bargaining, the same is true for nations. If you have a little guy versus a big guy, then you're not going to have equalization. But if you have a large number of little guys, so to speak, versus one big guy, then you're going to have equalization. And where do we see this? Well, we see this with the most favored nations agreements that we see, where all partners are considered equal. You can't have that in a bilateral trade agreement because there's no way you can treat all partners equally. Whereas in multilateral trade agreements, it treats everyone fair. It treats everyone equally. And as we actually saw, according to that balance point, it benefits these developing nations because it makes them more competitive. So that was a lot to unpack there, but we see that there's far more fairness in a multilateral world because it forces countries to treat everyone equally. We see that with most favored nations and versus the Belt and Road Initiative of where a clear example of bilateralism between China and individual countries. And what does that result with? Untransparent dealings, debt traps in many cases, or a greater influence by the Chinese government. So there's a difference. Multilateralism is about having fairness for all countries. Bilateralism is an agreement that advantages one group, essentially in most cases, while hurting the other or leaving out others. So there's no guarantee of fairness, but we solve. So going on
PY
to this, sorry, I don't have any time right now, though I'd love to take it if I did. But going on to the final point of protectionism, this idea that bilateral trade allows for tariffs. Yes, it does. But here's the thing, this benefits us from the perspective of developing nations, because as we showed from that balance card, multilateral trade agreements increase global trade, but specifically benefit developing nations because they have lower cost of labor. They have lower cost for goods. When you have tariffs, that benefits developed nations, not developing. And so that point goes to us because we're looking at what developing nations should prefer to do. And so clearly that goes on our side. Our opponent practically gives us this point. Now, going throughout this case, we see numerous points have come up. We've addressed all my opponent's points, and that my opponent has never given a single example of a multilateral trade agreement that is negative in the status quo, that has had deep impacts. My opponent doesn't have impacts, but we clearly do. And where do we see this? Well, of course, we see this with the increase in trade, with helping developing nations have greater access and have greater fairness, with having fairness in itself on the diplomatic stage. But we also see this with international cooperation, something my opponents never responded to and something that's going to be essential to today's round. Because having multilateral agreements is necessary to have institutions that span the world, that are able to mediate international conflicts, promote human rights, facilitate trade, and deal with pressing issues like climate change. See, this is important because when we're talking about climate change, we see, of course, the 3.4 million people who are already dying, the displacements we're going to see in these developing countries. But we also see the fact that regardless of what issue you look at, climate change, democracy, trade, you need multilateral institutions to facilitate it. We're talking about the UN. We're talking about these organizations that are able to accomplish it. And so clearly, we see developing nations should act in favor of multilateral trade agreements on the basis of trade in their economy, on the basis of having greater fairness and greater bargaining power, and on the basis of solving for climate change, having cooperation, and creating a better world for all. Thank you.
Okay. If everybody is ready, quick off-time roadmap. MG was wonderfully organized, so I'm just gonna, very easy for me to just go down flow here. So that's what I'll do. Everybody, so op case, then gov case. So I'll start my time now. Okay, let's talk about the first thing that MG tells you. They tell you that there's no way to evaluate equal valuing of bilateral and multilateral. We tell you that there actually is a way to evaluate that, which is what my partner tells you at the top of their speech, which is if something is an incidental benefit of a multilateral agreement, like if multilateral agreements happen, like many of them happen to be good and many bilateral agreements happen to be bad, you vote for us. Why? Because there is no structural reason to prefer multilateral agreements over bilateral agreements. All you do is prefer better agreements, and that happens to take you like maybe in the direction of some like multilateral agreements which happen to have better terms. Our point is that when you don't prefer either of them, you only look at the text of the agreement and not like any of and not like whether or not they're bilateral and multilateral. Gov is committed to arguing that you should look at least in part at whether or not an agreement is multilateral and bilateral, right? Also, like lots of bilateral agreements are very good, but you just don't hear about them because they're smaller. Like what new U.S. news outlet is reporting on like Somalia and like Uganda trading with each other? Like nobody is, but they are probably good. I'll get to that later. So in this round, the burden of the burden of either side is to prove that there is a structural reason why a country might prefer a bilateral as opposed to a multilateral, or a multilateral as opposed to a bilateral. Look at structure, not on incident. I'm going to get into this, why this matters later. So let's talk about what Gov says to our case. First, on strength, they say nations are cooperating, institutions outlive any one members, as opposed to if somebody leaves a bilateral agreement, the trade ends. I think that like this is kind of mischaracterizing what happens in a bilateral agreement. A bilateral agreement, as long as you're trading with a country, doesn't end unless one country literally stops trading with the other like fully, which doesn't happen. If you have a bilateral agreement, what happens is when one country isn't satisfied with the terms of the agreement, they just change the terms of the agreement so that they're more like good for either party. You can't do this with a multilateral agreement because nobody wants to, or most people don't want to change it. And the agreement is rather than like changing, it's going to end, right? And so like Bilateral agreements are flexible and allow for change, whereas multilateral agreements are not flexible and either are there or they're not, or you just leave or you stay. It's very binary in that way because you can't renegotiate. But this isn't actually the point of this contention. The point of this contention is that like we would prefer that people stay in the agreements that they're in, because when they stay in the agreements, it means that we can trade with them, right? Like trading is like probably good as long as I'll get to later, you're picking countries which you should be trading with, right? We don't want a country to arbitrarily stop trading with us, right? And so insofar as we prove that if you join a multilateral trade agreement, as opposed to simply doing bilateral trade with all of the countries involved, you're more likely to have one of them just back out and stop trading with you, as opposed to a bilateral agreement where you're less likely to back out for all the warranting we give you, which was, by the way, completely unresponded to, about how, like, in the political sphere, it creates an attitude where the country is likely to feel connected to the other country and is not likely to, like, fully withdraw from the agreement, as opposed to multilateral. We think that we win that, right? Because we want to continue trading. I think this is an independent reason to vote for us. They just don't interact with what this contention is actually about. Let's talk about control. They say the debate is what's good for developing countries. I agree. I'll talk about why this means we win later. They say a big nation has a lot to offer versus a small nation with little to offer, no equal trade without other countries. And then you should sort of look at unionization as an example here. Global trade is not a union. That's not how this works. So what do I mean by this? Like, the point of our case is not that the comparative is either trading with the U.S. bilaterally or trading with the U.S. multilaterally. Our point is that the comparative is trading with the U.S. multilaterally or not trading with the U.S. Like, just trading with countries specifically who will give you beneficial terms and, like, who are going to be good for your economy. Why do we think that this is better? Like, why do we think protectionism is better? Like, we give you a whole contention about it, which they just do not interact with. I'll restate the words because they're worth restating. Like, Gov literally tells you, guys, look, we give you a card about how developing countries are better in multilateral trade because of their low labor costs. That's a direct quote. On side up, we just say, judges, why are their costs of labor low? Why is that a predicate for them engaging in international trade? And we tell you that cost of labor is low because the U.S. can afford to pay workers more and still produce goods cheaply because we have built up the economic infrastructure like technology, not right now. We built up the economic infrastructure like technology to be able to produce goods like far more efficiently than a developing country can. Because they don't have the same infrastructure, they have to resort, in order to be competitive, to paying workers less and creating sweatshop conditions. We tell you that this is, in the long run, terrible for developing countries because they're trapped in a cycle where the only way they can be competitive, because they've never developed the infrastructure, is to keep lowering working conditions and paying workers less. Why is this bad? We want developing countries to actually develop and not stay perpetually in a state of non-development, right? In order to develop, you need to give people money. You need to give workers money so that they can become more educated. So that when you have a more educated populace, you innovate more. You have access to technology. You can create technology even, and you allow yourself to be able to produce goods better. That's how the U.S. actually developed. We were highly, highly protectionist at the start of the country, and Britain was also highly, highly protectionist. That's how our countries developed. And then once we were able to cross the threshold at which point we can innovate, then we start being multilateral, right? And we start engaging in international. Yeah, sure.
So I just have a two-part question. Can you name any highly protectionist countries in today's world? And can you also tell me how protectionism benefits not the United States, but developing nations?
I couldn't name protectionist countries, although I will say that the U.S. has recently engaged in some heavily protectionist policies. I don't know enough to give you a protectionist country, although China is actually pretty protectionist, so that's a good one. They have a far better economy than we do. They're developing faster, so I think that's a good example. But also, the argument isn't that there exist protectionist policies. The argument is that just because developing countries have been bullied by the World Trade Organization into joining unfair trade agreements doesn't mean that those agreements are good, and us giving you structural reasons as to why these are bad ought always be preferred over Gov just telling you that there are no such examples. I don't remember the other part of your question, so I'm not going to answer it. Okay, in terms of control, this isn't a union. We argue that you should simply not trade with the U.S. and that this is better because it allows you to, in the long run, develop your economy and actually have good standard of life for your citizens. Okay, then they say debt traps and non-transparent dealings when bilateral agreements are involved. Again, it's unclear why structurally bilateral agreements lead to debt traps. You can just look at the agreement and be like, oh, this is a debt trap, and then not do it, right? Just because some agreements that are bilateral is bad doesn't mean that bilateral agreements are necessarily bad. Okay, let's talk about protectionism. I kind of already talked about this. This is our third contention. They say multilateral increase global trade and benefit developing nations. Again, they benefit developing nations only insofar as they remain in cycles of non-development where they pay their workers a lot less money. Flow this through cleanly. It has never been responded to. They have lower labor costs. Lower labor costs are bad. We have no examples of negative multilateral trade agreements. We tell you that the WTO is trapping developing nations in cycles of deindustrialization and debt, and us telling you why this is structurally true is a lot better than them just asserting that there are good deals. Okay, so let's talk about GovCase. They say international cooperation necessary to have institutions. You can be part of the UN, but not like necessarily economically engaged. You can be part of military alliances which like guarantee human rights without having economic alliances. These are just two different things. Also, human rights organizations are historically terrible at enforcing human rights, especially as it relates to like large countries doing them. So this isn't going to result in anything. Climate change, literally not a point. In fact, it probably flows to us because from the developing countries' perspective, we would much rather not be forced into changing to renewable resources before we're able. And also China and the US are simply not going to stop like polluting the atmosphere. There's no solvency. They're not like a developing country joining this is not going to make climate change happen less. Also, their point about cultural exchange probably flows to our side because as a developing country, we don't want cultural genocide to happen. We would rather you have local drinks than like Coke and Pepsi. This is probably principally good. Also, neocolonialism is bad. Cultural exchange,
overtime.
Mostly the US. I have my time stopping now, but there it is. Time is over anyway.
We all good? Feeling ready? Feeling active? I hope. I'm going to begin my time now. Okay, let's get into it. What do I think is the most important issue in this round? The round that I think, judges should very clearly give us this round to us on the ability to practice protectionism, which is very important for a developing nation. Our opponents ask, name what are like some countries in the world, like developed countries in the world that are doing protectionism now. And I tell you that the reason why we don't see any developed countries in the world practicing protectionism now is because usually if a government had the policy of protectionism, it wouldn't be a developing country anymore. You can look, for example, with China, which did practice protectionism, which did have this very isolated economy, time to build up local industry, state control and massive and like high tariffs, etc. And now they're like, the largest industrial power in the world, right? I think that is a fundamentally successful strategy. I'm not saying every developing nation is going to turn out to be China, but I think that every developing nation can reach standards of quality of life at least comparable to China's through the policy of protectionism. I think this worked for China. I think that we provide extensive warranting, which my opponents have not refuted effectively, and which my partner has reinforced, which make clear why protectionism works and why it is so important to have protectionism to increase your standards of living and education, to have more power on the negotiating table, etc. Just to reinforce, why is it that multilateral agreements can often preclude the ability to practice protectionism? Because fundamentally, what is best for it's kind of a tragedy of the commons thing, where free trade provides like marginal benefits for everyone, and protectionism provides a kind of specific large benefit for the nations at hand, right? Fundamentally, multilateral agreements are about generally multilateral agreements are not, we're agreeing not to do things with each other, right? We're agreeing not to trade with each other. Is not what happens, not what occurs. Which is just to say, I don't know, our opponents say, what is a multilateral agreement right now, which restrains the ability for developing nations to become developed. To some extent, the World Trade Organization. To some extent, you can see how even not even developed nations, but comparative developed nations, which are still somewhat weak economically, get screwed over by large multilateral organizations. You can see what happened with Spain and Greece during the 2008 kind of housing bubble in Europe. You get screwed over economically as a comparatively small nation in a large multinational economic agreement, particularly when, as a developing nation, you are even weaker, have even less influence than a place like Spain or Greece. I think that there's a clear distinction between kind of charitable multinational organizations, which of course if they're giving the countries benefits from larger nations kind of out of an altruistic will, of course those are good things, right? And kind of multilateral agreements, which are kind of these multilateral, sides are kind of negotiating with each other things, that in this kind of situation, we have provided clear warranting, which once again I think goes unresponded to, and which my partner reinforced about how it is that when a bilateral agreement actually gives smaller countries more negotiating power with a larger country versus being crowded being kind of crowded out by the majority, having this ability to kind of quote unquote, kind of bet with your life, bet with your livelihood, put everything on the table. I think once again, I think this flows through. I think that engaging in more bilateral agreements give countries more power over themselves, which includes, most importantly, the ability to practice protectionism, which is a way to stop being a developing nation. In terms of like vague ideas of international cooperation, firstly, I think that obviously, if it's something generally beneficial, doesn't mean we're not doing it. This is about preferences. And secondly, I think that in terms of the impact of like maybe climate change, regulations which are most usually enforced through like domestic policy versus like international standards that countries break all the time. I do not think that multilateral agreements are actually the way that's going to stop that. I think my partner made that clear. And whatever like kind of marginal positive benefit towards like climate change, somewhat like whatever, like a half an inch less of sea level rise versus like, the ability for a nation to like no longer be in like abject poverty, to build up its own industry, to educate its people. I think it's very clear that you should give this round to the opposition. Thank you.
Alrighty. Oh. What about now? Okay, there we go. Now we'll go over voter issues for AF. We'll explain why AF wins. And it's a 5-minute speech. I mean, you guys know that. So at the top of the neg case, they start talking about how we need a structural justification for why you should prefer multilateral agreements to bilateral agreements. And we have plenty of them written into the AF case, the first of which is the extortion factor. When we talk about bilateral agreements being used as a means for extortion, this is almost entirely dropped. The spread of autocratic regimes through the providence of financial resources to underdeveloped nations allows for the spread of communism, autocracy, authoritarianism in regions like Kazakhstan, Burgia, all the regions that I told you that are including the BRI, all of these regions that are getting the short end of the stick because they're in a bilateral agreement with an incredibly powerful nation. When you have an incredibly powerful nation entering a bilateral agreement with an incredibly weak nation, it means that they're going to be increasingly dependent on these nations rather than on a network of support. When we have multilateral agreements, however, in trade relations like the WTO, the WHO, the UN, we have protections for these things. Now, written into the constitution of these organizations, usually like the UN or NATO or the WTO, are protections for human rights. They say they're historically bad at preserving human rights, but that has nothing to do with the actual providence of human rights that have been provided to regions like Libya that needed human rights, needed healthcare when it was in crisis, Syria that went through a crisis, all of these things where the UN came in and helped. I mean, you can't say that it's bad, but also you can say it's considerably more beneficial to bilateral agreements because it doesn't pose the risk of extortion. They say they're being bullied into unfair agreements that aren't inherently helpful to each other, and multilateral trade agreements are bad, but they're actually more stable because they last longer than the members of the nation. If you don't agree with a multilateral agreement, you can leave the thing. They say that it's bad that you should be able to leave and you want to maintain consistent agreements, but I also disagree with this idea because the ability to choose, enter, and leave freely is a priority. When we're talking about what should be preferred over, we're talking about we should have a tendency to choose, and we have real impacts that they don't. Protectionism doesn't solve for the impacts that they provide. It's not fair, and it doesn't lead to an influx of capital to countries with no money, but multilateralism does. We saw the example of the decreased tariffs on, or the most favored nations in Latin America, leading to the 900% increase in trade. When we saw that happen, we saw Latin America experience incredible prosperity. We saw increases in human rights experience. We saw increases in education, employment, housing, all these things in Latin America that happened as a result of a multilateral agreement. They don't provide any examples of why multilateral agreements are bad or any examples of bad multilateral agreements, but we've provided ample examples of bad bilateral agreements. Bilateral agreements are really easy to use to extort a smaller country. And when you are a developing country, you're incredibly vulnerable and you need more checks and balances. Checks and balances and extortion are the two biggest voter issues for the AF. When you're looking at checks and balances, you need to consider that there needs to be multiple parties overseeing an agreement to make sure that everybody is on the same page. If somebody isn't on the same page, you're welcome to leave the agreement, and the consequences of that are far less impactful than when you're in a bilateral agreement that has no security after you leave them. Furthermore, on multilateralism and most favored nations, we don't really see any response to the increase in prosperity in these regions, so you need to flow that through. Multilateralism is beneficial because you don't have the extortion factor and you do have the protection factor. Cooperation is needed for fixing global issues. This is another point that can only be achieved through multilateralism. I provided to you the idea that globalism is essential to innovation, which is essential to receiving the technology necessary to fight things like climate change, pressing issues, economic developments, and providing fair human rights protections in these regions. Without the globalized innovation, we won't have the actual access or outreach to these nations. Bilateral agreements sure can be beneficial in certain contexts, but they certainly should not be preferred to multilateral agreements when we're talking about developing nations, because these are the most vulnerable ones. When we're talking about the structural reasons, you need to see that we don't solve or help developing nations, and our opponent is incredibly American-centric, focusing on the impacts of bilateral preference. But when we're looking at every single piece of legislation only by the structure, that doesn't mean we're going to avoid debt traps, because those still definitely happen in bilateral relations. Things like the BRI still definitely happen and take over areas like Kazakhstan and spread communism through the Middle East, through Africa, through all these regions. But developing countries develop better in multilateral agreements because they have more access to resources, more member nations contributing to their economy, more member nations contributing to their military, and all of these agreements are considerably more beneficial. And that's the structural reason you need to actually focus on multilateral relations. Now, they also say that unbalanced trade is a big issue, but tariffs make developing nations that lack infrastructure less competitive, which prevents the influx of money for these developing nations. Protectionism used by developing nations limits the competition, which makes it less successful for them to develop. China's main rise to power occurred under a multilateral agreement, free trade agreement, which led to a number of I apologize, that was miswritten. And we're seeing a lot of issues with the precedence of bilateral agreements in these cases. When we have bilateral agreements, we need to prioritize the actual protection of human rights, and therefore ought to prefer multilateral agreements over bilateral agreements in developing countries. Why were you giving me time signals? That was my 5-minute AF.
Shit.
You just made me stop 20 seconds early.
Sorry.
Your mic's still on.
Yes, that is the conclusion of the speech. Regardless, I don't have much more time.
All right, cool. We'll take a few seconds here and then come back with RFTs.
Yeah, great round.
I'm ready if the other judges.
Yep, anytime.
Good. Yeah.
Cool, and you're more than welcome to go first if you.
Okay, sure. Okay, so I voted Gov. I will go in order and try to keep it pretty quick here. So first on the framework stuff, I think there's a tendency in rounds like this for there to be a bit of a race to the middle and everyone to agree that, it's like there's still going to be some of both and to try to be quite accommodating and reasonable. But I think that can actually make things a bit less clear. I do think strategically it's really better to kind of go hard on the benefits of your type of agreements, even to the exclusion of a lot of possibly beneficial other ones. And I think that could have given some clarity about kind of what agreements we're going for, when we're going for those, if you can simultaneously have both types of agreements with different countries. And obviously that happens in the real world, but it's a very sort of complex situation that it's worth kind of explaining and talking about, like from the perspective of a developing country, how does accepting one type of agreement kind of affect your ability to engage in others or affect the way in which you engage with other countries. So I think a little bit more clarity from both sides around that topic in general would have been really helpful. But now moving on to like the actual kind of clashes in the round, I think the big one for me and where I ended up voting was the sort of extortion or kind of debt trap argument. And I think Gov was ahead on this for a few reasons. I mean, first, I think we have some pretty strong analysis that smaller nations kind of need to band together to get more bargaining power, and that global norms around the kind of the size or the kind of the historical institutional nature of these big multinational agreements avoid some of the situations you get into when you're beholden to Russia or China, where you have a kind of one-to-one relationship. And I think there are a lot of good examples that are given in the speech of that being true, but I also think the kind of structural analysis there is probably the kind of the most coherent and the kind of the longest that we get coming out of the speeches. So I think that's where I end up voting. And I think in the absence of kind of stronger offensive ground for op on this point about why these multilateral agreements might pose like worse risks, I'm pretty happy to vote Gov here. I think op does have a lot of good kind of mitigatory responses here about how the UN isn't maybe the most effective with their human rights records and other areas where things might not be perfect there, but I just don't think this is quite enough. I think there's also, again, on this point, a little bit of messiness about kind of like how and when countries can leave agreements. So I think for both sides, it would be better to kind of discuss the conditions in which, because again, like the whole nature of the debt trap is that you kind of can't get out of it because you are literally in debt to the other country. So some discussion about kind of conditions in which these things stop being true for the countries and when these obligations are no longer there, I think would be really helpful. The next big clash that came out was the sort of global issues thing, that, climate change, regulating space, all of that sort of stuff. I think there's a good op response here about climate change and how it's unlikely to be these countries that are specifically going to push us over the edge. But I do think maybe in order to expand this again to some sort of offensive ground, to get some more room for you guys to win here, I think would just be really important. Maybe talking about how this might be a moral obligation or how these countries really specifically need that thing in order to be able to develop something about that to find a little bit of offense here, because again, that argument seemed a bit mitigatory to me. It's a hard place for you to win directly. The last point was protectionism, where you tried to collapse here in the last speech, and I think off does get some good offense here on how working conditions are perhaps worse if you're forced into free trade agreements. But I do think this is pretty well mitigated again by some government examples. I think they mentioned Libya and the kind of the overall record of the UN being perhaps more positive on this point than certain bilateral agreements that people might get into with Russia and China. And then also comparing it to the benefits of growth via expanded free trade and such. I think there are a lot of ways in here in which Gov mitigates some of these arguments. And even so, I do end up comparing it to the impacts that I get out of the kind of extortion, debt trap genre of arguments. And I do think those are perhaps a bit more strongly impacted and weighed. So I think coming into the final speeches, if perhaps protectionism had been weighed a bit more, kind of explicitly against some of those arguments, it would have been more possible to pick up the ballot here. But I think overall, I would say maybe coming down to a bit of more clarity from both sides. But there were kind of, nuggets of good analysis from both sides, definitely. And overall, I think, definitely very enjoyable to watch. So good job, everyone. Thank you.
Yep. So I am just going to go very quickly because I agree with what my panelists said. So I also sided with Gov for mostly the same reasons. The two main being, let me pull up my RFD. The two main being the idea of power imbalances and this concept of extortion. So on the death trap argument, I agree that smaller nations kind of need the protections of institutions with more structural integrity. This is coming from, I believe it was the MG, this argument about these constitutions already having these pre-existing protections. And this goes along with like human rights, education, labor, things like that. That doesn't make them more susceptible to making agreements with autocratic regimes and things of that nature. And then on another voter for me was this idea of relationship strength versus freedom to leave. And therefore leaving's like the magnitude of leaving's consequences. So I did side with Op that I agree that it's harder to leave a bilateral agreement entirely, but I ended up picking up on Gov's argument that that if an agreement is no longer benefiting a developing country, they have more freedom in a multilateral agreement, both to negotiate and also to leave if they find necessary. So for me, I just found Gov's argument better, or Gov's side better proved why this would be a better agreement for a developing country in generally speaking. But I did agree with the other judge that there was a bit of confusion coming out of the framework, which made this a bit of a harder round to adjudicate. But other than that, really good round. And for me, it was a pretty high speaking round as well. So.
Thanks.
All right. Yeah, great.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Have a great day.
I like what
Good
the rest
luck.
of the tournament.